The glass doors were exactly the way he remembered them. The same granite tile out front, the same brushed metal sign above the entrance. Nexora Games. Letters he'd personally signed off on years ago, arguing with the designer over how thick the serifs should be. He remembered that argument clearly. Strange, considering he couldn't remember his own mother's name. No, stop, he shook his head. The memory slipped away again, like a fish wriggling out of his hands. He stood about 10 feet from the entrance, staring at his own reflection in the glass for a long time. A man in his 40s, wearing a beat-up jacket that wasn't his, with stubble he hadn't shaved off in far too long, and eyes that didn't hold confusion so much as something heavier. The exhaustion of a man who'd been chasing his own trail for far too long. He pushed on the door. It didn't budge. The access system let out a beep, and a security guard stepped out from behind the front desk to meet him, young, built, in a crisply pressed uniform with a logo stitched over the chest. A logo he himself had designed 17 years ago in a cramped studio apartment in Seattle at a desk he'd built out of old wooden shipping pallets. "This building's closed to the public," the guard said. Polite, but firm. The tone people use with someone they've mistaken for homeless. "I need to see the CEO," he answered calmly. "The CEO's in a meeting right now. If you've got an appointment, check in at the front desk of the business center across the street." "I don't have an appointment." He gave a short laugh, the first time in ages that laugh had carried even a trace of the man he used to be. "But I think he'll see me. Tell him the man who founded this company is here." The guard exchanged a glance with his partner. There was no mockery on his face, no cruelty. Just a mild, polite bewilderment. The look people give someone who's lost track of what year it is. "I'm sorry, sir, but the founder of this company is Derek Collins. His photo's on the wall in the lobby. You must have the wrong address." He was quiet for a second. Then another. "Derek Collins is my vice president," he said quietly. "Was, anyway." A short laugh came from behind the desk. Not cruel, just the kind of laugh people give when something sounds absurd and they don't want to be rude about it. "You need to move along," the guard said, his voice hardening, "or I'll have to call the police." He looked at his reflection in the glass one more time, at a man standing on the doorstep of a company he had built, from the very first line of code to the last logo printed on an employee t-shirt. A company where, right now, behind these doors, a meeting was happening without him. He turned and walked away without another word. There was still so much he didn't remember. He didn't remember his childhood, the taste of his mother's cooking, the first bell of his first day of school. What memory gave him back came only in fragments, like faded photographs with the edges worn away. But one thing he knew with absolute, icy certainty, the kind that needs no proof at all. This was his company. And someone, very methodically, very patiently, had erased him from his own life. To understand how he ended up here, broke and invisible outside the walls of an empire he'd built with his own 2 hands, you have to go back 2 years, to the day an ordinary business trip turned into the collapse of everything he had. His name was Adam Walker. 17 years earlier, he'd been nothing more than a programmer from a small town in Idaho, renting a room and living on instant ramen because a junior developer's salary barely covered rent. His father died when Adam was 12, and his mother raised him alone, pulling double shifts as a cook in a school cafeteria. The one thing she managed to give him was a belief that hard work is never wasted. He carried one line from her his whole life. "Work like nobody's watching, son. One day, somebody will." Adam wrote his first game at night after his shift at an office job where he built boring software for other people. A simple little platformer about a boy trying to find his way home. He put it out for free, assuming nobody would ever notice it. 6 months later, it had 2 million downloads. That was how the story began of a company that, 15 years later, would be known as Nexora Games, one of the largest game development studios, engine developers, and digital media companies in the country, headquartered in Seattle, Washington. Adam built it from nothing, with no connections, no inheritance, no one pulling strings for him, just his mind, his stubbornness, and 10,000 sleepless nights. Getting rich didn't change him. He still remembered the names of the office cleaning staff and the birthdays of his QA testers. He personally answered emails from young developers who sent him their first prototypes. When an employee's kid got sick, Adam quietly paid for the treatment without ever mentioning it. He never raised his voice. He never made anyone feel small. People who worked with him all said the same thing. You want to keep going for him, because he never takes more than his share of the credit. The one person he trusted without reservation was his wife. Her name was Christine. They met back when the company was just starting to grow, before he had millions, before he had a downtown office, when all he had was a rented apartment and a stubborn belief in what he was building. Christine was beautiful in that calm, deliberate way that doesn't fade with age, but only sharpens. She knew how to listen, knew when to stay quiet, knew how to build a sense of warmth and stability around herself. Adam never suspected that underneath that warmth was a woman for whom feelings had always been a tool, never a purpose. Christine hadn't married him purely out of calculation, not at first. In the beginning, she really had been drawn in by his energy, his mind, the way he was nothing like the other men who were always bragging about the millions they were going to make someday. But over the years, as the company grew, and the money, the status, and the influence grew right along with it, something in her shifted. She got used to luxury faster than she ever got used to love. And slowly, whatever feeling had once been real wore away, leaving behind only a cold, carefully maintained front. Adam never saw it. He trusted too much. "You never ask me where I've been all day," Christine said once, when he came home from yet another meeting that had run long. "Because I trust you," he answered simply. "You don't ask me for a play-by-play of my hours either." She smiled then, an odd little smile he mistook for tenderness. In reality, it was the smile of a woman who had just confirmed the plan was going to work. Derek Collins had joined the company 8 years earlier, a sharp, polished finance guy with a flawless resume and the kind of charm that comes from a lifetime of being liked. Adam brought him on as vice president because Derek was good at exactly the things Adam wasn't. Talking to investors in the language of spreadsheets, smiling through negotiations when he wanted to grind his teeth, fighting the long, grinding bureaucratic battles that frankly wore Adam out. Christine and Derek first met at a company event celebrating the studio's 5th anniversary. Adam himself had introduced them, proudly walking his wife over by the arm. He didn't notice a thing, not the quick, appraising look that passed between the two of them, not how naturally Derek kissed her hand and held it a second longer than he should have. Their affair didn't start right away. First, there were chance run-ins at company events, then business lunches that Christine mentioned to her husband in passing, then brief phone calls she explained away as charity work. Adam never checked up on any of it. It never even crossed his mind to. Derek saw exactly what Christine saw, an enormous, flawlessly built company that legally belonged to one man, trusting, decent, a man who never signed anything without being completely sure of a partner's honesty. The only problem was that Adam Walker was alive, healthy, and firmly in control of everything he had built. "We can't just walk away from him and end up with nothing," Christine said one evening, late, in an apartment Derek kept specifically for their meetings, in a part of the city Adam never had reason to visit. "A divorce leaves me with the condo. I need the company. We need the company." "Divorce isn't an option," Derek agreed, lighting a cigarette by the window. "As long as he's healthy and in his right mind, no court, no attorney is going to let you walk away with anything real. He's too careful in business, even if he's too trusting in life." "Then what?" "He needs to disappear from the picture for a while. Not permanently, just drop out of the game long enough for us to get everything in order. An accident, a coma, something that makes it physically impossible for him to run the company or sign anything. And after that, we'll have time." Christine was quiet for a long while, staring out into the dark window. "I don't want anything to actually happen to him," she said finally. And in that sentence was, it seemed, the last trace left of the woman she used to be. "I just want my life. The one I deserve." "Nobody's talking about killing him," Derek said, calm as ever. "Just an accident. A small one. A controlled one." They weren't impulsive villains out of some cheap crime drama. They were people who spent months turning over every step in their heads, weighing every risk, quietly consulting, through go-betweens, carefully, with lawyers who would never learn the real purpose behind the questions. The plan came together slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle. All that was left was to find the last piece, someone who would carry out the controlled accident, and never, under any circumstances, be traced back to either of their names. His name was Neil Graham, a 46-year-old long-haul trucker who'd spent more than 20 years behind the wheel of a Peterbilt, a man with tired hands and kind eyes that had long since filled with worry. His daughter, Paige, barely 7 years old, had been diagnosed with a rare blood disorder. The doctors chose their words carefully, but Neil understood well enough without them spelling it out. Without an expensive, urgent surgery overseas, his little girl wasn't going to see another summer. The $200,000 the clinics were quoting was simply out of reach for a trucker, no matter how many years he'd worked himself to the bone. He sold his parents' old mobile home out on the edge of the county. He borrowed from everyone he could think to borrow from. He picked up a second job working nights. It still wasn't enough, not even close. That's when, through a middleman, a man who introduced himself only as Frank, no last name, no questions asked, Neil got an offer. "There's a job," Frank said when they met at a roadside diner. A meeting he'd arranged knowing everything about Neil's daughter, his debts, his desperation. "Simple one. You just need to cause a car accident with a specific vehicle at a specific time on a specific stretch of highway. Nobody's going to get seriously hurt. Modern cars protect the driver just fine in a side impact at that speed. This guy just needs to disappear from his life for a few months. You understand? Just be out of the picture for a while. Quiet family situation, a divorce thing. You don't need to know the details. In exchange, you get enough money to cover your daughter's surgery. And then some." Hey friends, real quick break from the story. If this one's already hitting home for you, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. It's not just a number to me. It tells me these true everyday stories are finding the people who need them. And I'd love to get to know you a little better. Drop your age in the comments, because behind every number is a whole life, its own memories, its own wins, its own hard days. Thanks for being here. Now, back to the story. Neil sat quiet for a long time, staring into a cup of cold coffee. "I'm not a killer," he said quietly. "Nobody's asking you to be a killer," Frank said with a mild smile. "It's just an accident. Happens on the roads every day. You won't even know who's behind it, and the guy won't really get hurt. He'll spend a little time in the hospital. That's it. Think of it as doing something good for your own family without doing anything real to somebody else's. Neil wasn't a bad man. He was a father staring down an impossible choice. Stay completely honest and maybe bury his daughter, or go against his own conscience so she could live. He said yes. He didn't know the man's name. All he was given was a make and model, a plate number, a stretch of highway, and a time. Nobody told him the man behind the wheel was Adam Walker himself, the man whose company had given a childhood to millions of kids just like Paige. Nobody told him that behind this controlled accident stood the cold calculations of two people plotting to steal somebody else's entire life. Neil thought he was helping solve someone's business problem. He had no idea he was helping carry out one of the cruelest betrayals imaginable. That day, Adam was driving to an important meeting with foreign investors, negotiations that could open the company's doors to the European market. He was driving himself, his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the way he always did when he wanted a quiet moment to think before a big conversation. Christine had been unusually affectionate that morning, kissing him goodbye a little longer than usual, asking him to text her along the way. He chalked it up to love. In reality, she wanted to know exactly which stretch of highway he'd be on at exactly the right time. Neil Graham was waiting on the agreed-upon stretch of road, a narrow section of highway outside town, with a sharp curve, poor visibility, and a guardrail that had needed repair for years. The plan was simple: a light side impact at moderate speed, enough to cause a serious but non-fatal injury. But reality, as it so often does with other people's cold calculations, turned out to be far crueler than the plan on paper. The asphalt was still wet from an earlier rain. Neil couldn't fully kill his speed in time. At the moment of impact, instead of just taking a dent and sliding into a controlled skid, Adam's car caught a wheel on a damaged section of the shoulder and flipped once, twice, 3 times, crumpling metal, shattering glass, turning a pristine vehicle into a mangled heap of steel. Dazed, Neil scrambled out of his cab and ran toward the overturned car. Adam lay inside, unconscious, blood covering his face. In that moment, the trucker felt, maybe for the first time in his life, real fear over what he had done. He couldn't call an ambulance himself. That would have blown the entire plan, exposed him completely. While he stood frozen, torn between conscience and fear, another car, one Neil hadn't been told about, was waiting nearby on the highway. People sent by Frank pulled up behind him, stripped the plates, took Adam's wallet, his phone, his watch, anything that could help identify him. They called in the ambulance anonymously, only after they'd taken everything they needed, and were gone before the paramedics arrived. Neil watched it happen. He wanted to scream, to stop them, but fear, for himself, for his daughter, for everything that could collapse if he opened his mouth, won out. He stood in silence and watched the car full of strangers drive off, followed by the ambulance carrying an unconscious Adam, taking him to a hospital in another state, deliberately, because that had been part of the plan from the start. Neil was left alone on the empty highway that night, shaking, carrying a feeling that would follow him every single day for the rest of this story. A guilt no amount of money could ever wash away. He got his payment. He paid for his daughter's surgery. Paige survived, and slowly she started to get better. But every night, tucking her into bed, Neil saw that bloodied face in front of him, the face of a man whose life he had just destroyed without ever meaning to. The hospital in the small town of Riverbend, Montana, a good 10 hours from Seattle, wasn't built for headlines. The ambulance brought in a man with no ID, no phone, not a single clue as to who he was. The diagnosis was serious. Severe traumatic brain injury, internal bleeding, multiple fractures. The doctors fought for his life for 3 days without even knowing his name. When Adam finally came to, the first thing he felt wasn't pain. It was emptiness. A total, all-consuming emptiness where his memory should have been. "What's your name?" a young nurse asked, leaning over him. He opened his mouth to answer and realized he didn't know. He stopped. He tried to reach for something. His mother's face, his own address, a phone number. Nothing. Just darkness. And every so often, like flashes of distant lightning, a few random images surfaced, disconnected, with no context at all. Retrograde amnesia from the severity of the head trauma, a doctor said later, studying the scans. It's not unusual with this kind of injury. His memory may come back partially or fully over time, or it may not. We can't promise a timeline. The county police tried to identify him, standard procedure for a patient with no ID. But the request got lost somewhere in the paperwork of a small sheriff's department that had no obvious reason to connect it to a missing businessman in another state. As it would later come out, no missing person report had ever been filed for a man named Adam Walker, because there was no one left to file one. Christine knew exactly where he was. She simply said nothing. For 6 months, Adam existed in the hospital's records as unidentified male, room 14. The staff, just to have something to call him, started using the name Adam because that was the one name the patient kept reaching for, eyes shut, groping through the dark of his memory. The one name that kept surfacing again and again like an anchor that had finally caught the bottom. At night he had strange, fractured dreams. Monitors with flickering graphs, conference rooms full of people, a screen with a logo spinning on it, 3 interlocking lines forming something like the letter N. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, straining to understand what the images meant, but by morning they always dissolved like fog. He didn't know that a woman's face sometimes flickered through those dreams too. Beautiful, cold, hair perfectly styled. He'd wake with an inexplicable unease he couldn't place. The days in the hospital dragged on, slow and identical. He learned to hold a spoon again with the hand that was less damaged. He learned to walk down the hallway, gripping the rail. Piece by piece, with no outside help at all, his own identity slowly began rebuilding itself. It was around then that the first real warmth entered his life, since everything had fallen apart. While Adam was relearning how to form words, Christine was moving fast and with a cold head. She learned about the accident that same night. A short call from Frank's people let her know the operation hadn't gone entirely to plan, but the outcome was the same. The target was out of the picture, in a hospital in a faraway state, with no ID and, most likely, no memory. Christine took the news with surprising calm. Somewhere deep down, something like a pang of guilt flickered, but she snuffed it out fast, the way you smother a stray spark before it can catch fire to a carefully built plan. For the first 3 days, she played the part of the worried wife, calling his office, asking why he wasn't answering, even filing a formal missing persons report with the police. But the report was so vague, so full of inconsistencies about dates and routes, that the investigation stalled almost immediately. A week later, Christine, as if giving in to despair, stopped pushing for an active search. "Maybe he just needs some time alone. He's been under so much stress at work lately," she told sympathetic acquaintances, skillfully planting the seed of doubt. Maybe he'd just walked away, run from the weight of his own success. At the same time, Derek Collins, as vice president, took over temporary management of the company, officially with the blessing of a board he'd spent years quietly stacking with people who owed him favors. He explained Adam's absence delicately. A personal crisis, taking time to recover, asked us not to make a thing of it. Nobody questioned the word of a man who'd spent 8 years proving his competence and loyalty. Christine, meanwhile, went to work on the paperwork. As his wife, she had access to plenty of her husband's personal documents, and she used that access without a moment's hesitation. With help from a notary Derek had kept on a leash for years through old financial debts, a power of attorney was drawn up, backdated to look as though Adam had signed it before the accident, granting Christine sweeping control over their shared assets. The document looked completely legitimate. A handwriting expert, also bought and paid for, was ready to vouch for the signature if anyone ever checked. 6 months into his disappearance, once the law allowed for it, Christine filed a petition to have her husband declared legally missing. The case was presented to the court flawlessly. Testimony from a grief-stricken wife, statements from co-workers about his emotional instability before he vanished, and not a single trace of him found in 6 months. The court granted the petition. Then came the divorce, filed essentially unilaterally, on the grounds of his legal absence. The sale of their shared home, now legally hers, per the court's asset division. The closing of Adam's personal accounts on the grounds that his power of attorney arrangement had expired. A full leadership shakeup across several key departments of the company. The handful of employees who might have recognized Adam on sight, or who might have questioned the official story, were quietly fired under polite pretexts or transferred to offices in other cities, one by one. A year later, Derek Collins was officially confirmed as CEO of Nexora Games. A few months after that, Christine and Derek, keeping up appearances, started appearing together in public, first as old friends leaning on each other after the tragedy, then, before long, as a couple. Everything was done so cleanly, so legally airtight, that from the outside it looked like an ordinary, if sad, story. A successful businessman had gone missing, unable to bear the pressure, and his grieving family and company had no choice but to carry on without him. Nobody suspected that 10 hours away, a man whose name had been struck from every document he'd ever signed was only just learning how to hold the spoon again. She came to the hospital every day at the same time after her shift ended at the local knitting mill. Her name was Sarah, 35 years old, divorced, raising an 8-year-old daughter, Molly, on her own. Her mother, recovering from a stroke, lay in room 4 down the same hallway, and Sarah, exhausted as she was, still needing to make dinner and help her daughter with homework after work, found an hour every single day to sit at her mother's bedside, feed her, talk with her. She didn't notice the nameless patient from room 14 right away. Not until one day she saw him carefully, hand against the wall, making his way toward the window at the end of the hallway, and then watched him suddenly lose his balance. Sarah was at his side before she'd even thought about it, catching his elbow, steadying him. "Thank you," he said quietly, breathing hard. "Let me walk you back," she said simply, without prying, without the kind of awkward sympathy that's sometimes worse than not caring at all. From that day on, she started stopping by his room after her visits with her mother. At first, just to say hello. Then she began bringing him home-cooked food, knowing hospital oatmeal didn't do much to rebuild strength, the way real chicken soup or a homemade apple pie could. The staff didn't mind. It was obvious the patient in room 14 had no one else to share the hard days with. Nobody ever came to visit him. Nobody ever called the nurses' station to check on him. "You really don't have anyone?" she asked once, setting a container of chicken soup in front of him. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I don't remember." She didn't gasp, didn't make a fuss the way some of the soft-hearted women in the ward did when they learned about his situation. She simply nodded, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and said, "Then we'll figure it out one piece at a time. Nobody's required to remember everything all at once." Being around her made things easier, not because she tried to cheer him up with forced jokes, but because she never pushed, never pried, never tried to force his memory back by sheer will. She was simply there, steady and calm, like someone for whom kindness wasn't a gesture, but a way of life. They talked for hours, not about his past since there wasn't one, but about the simplest things, what the sunset looked like that evening, how her daughter was scared of dogs but desperately wanted a puppy, how soup needed to sit for at least half a day before the flavor was right. In these conversations, free of any drama or heaviness, Adam, though he didn't yet know that name was his own, felt something like solid ground under his feet for the first time in longer than he could remember. Sarah never asked who he used to be. She saw, sitting in front of her, a man who, right now, in this moment, was kind, honest, and clearly alone. And that was enough for her. She had no idea she was sitting across from one of the richest men in the country. She simply saw a man. And that, as it would turn out, mattered far more than any amount of money. 8 months later, the doctors declared his physical recovery as complete as it was ever going to get. His memory never came back, only occasional flashes, disjointed and unsettling in their vagueness. The county social services board issued him a temporary ID under the name Unidentified Individual, known as Adam, handed him minimal state assistance, and, in essence, threw up their hands. From here on, he was on his own. He had no home, no family, not a single dollar beyond the small amount the state had given him. He stood on the hospital steps that spring day with a small bag of belongings, gifts from sympathetic patients he'd shared the ward with no idea where to go next. Sarah was waiting for him outside. "I've got my grandmother's old place out in the county, sitting empty," she said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "I go out there every weekend anyway with Molly, working on the garden. You can stay there while you figure out what's next. Where else are you going to go, all alone?" He wanted to say no. Pride, even stripped of a name and a past, still demanded he not become a burden to a stranger. But he genuinely had no other option, and there wasn't a trace of pity in Sarah's eyes, only the plain, everyday concern you'd show a neighbor whose roof had sprung a leak. "I'll work," he said then. "I don't want to be a burden." "Nobody said anything about a burden," she smiled. "You've got 2 hands, and out here, there's always more work than people to do it." That's how he ended up in a small house on the edge of the town of Mapleton, in an apple-growing valley in Montana, a place with a leaning fence, an old wood stove, and an overgrown yard. Sarah and her daughter lived in a bigger town nearby, but she drove out every weekend, and little by little, those weekends became something more than just visits out of politeness. He split firewood, even though at first he could barely keep a steady grip on the axe. He fixed the fence. He turned over the garden beds. Molly, Sarah's daughter, shy of the strange man at first, soon started following him everywhere, showing him where her grandmother used to plant strawberries, demanding he tell her a story, any story, as long as it was a good one. "I don't remember a single fairy tale," he admitted to her one day, spreading his hands apologetically. "Then make one up," the 8-year-old answered simply, with the kind of childhood logic that's sometimes wiser than anything grown-ups come up with. So he did. A story about a boy who got lost and forgot the way home, but found new friends who taught him how to smile again. Molly listened, breathless, with no idea how close to the truth the storyteller had come, without even realizing it himself. Step by step, without any grand words, A new person began to take shape out of a man with no name and no past. Not the brilliant company founder he had once been, but a simple, hard-working, kind man, slowly becoming part of the little family that had taken him in without asking for anything in return. Fall in Mapleton was golden and quiet. Apple-picking season across the old orchards that lined the valley. In the evenings, once Molly was asleep, Sarah and Adam would sit out on the porch for a long time, wrapped in her grandmother's old quilts, talking about everything and nothing at all. "Doesn't this wear you out?" he asked her once. "The job, your daughter, your mom in the hospital, and now me on top of it?" "You're not on top of anything," she said, shaking her head. "You earn your own keep. You've rebuilt half this house yourself. And besides," she hesitated, "I feel calmer when you're around. I won't lie about that." He looked at her in the glow of the kerosene lamp. They'd taken to saving on electricity more and more, and the lamplight was softer, warmer anyway. Her hands were worn from constant work, her face plain and unadorned, but her eyes held such quiet strength, such gentle, unassuming kindness, that he found himself thinking, even if he never got his old life back, this one, the one taking shape right now, was more than worth living. Whatever was growing between them wasn't some sudden spark of passion. It grew out of small things, the way she'd hand him a cup of coffee without a word, already knowing he didn't take sugar. The way he, without being asked, fixed the leak in the roof over her room before she'd even noticed it herself. Shared chores in the garden, shared laughter over Molly's clumsy attempts to teach him hopscotch. Quiet evenings with no TV, no internet, filled with nothing but conversation and the sounds of the countryside at night. He began to notice he looked forward to her arrival every Friday with a growing eagerness. That he smiled, remembering something she'd said a week earlier. That for the first time since the accident, he felt something deeper than gratitude. Something warmer. Sarah, for her part, was fighting her own battle. After a failed marriage that had left her with nothing but scars and a deep distrust of men, she'd sworn to herself she'd never fall in love again. It had cost her too much the last time. But this quiet, hard-working, remarkably kind man with no past was breaking down her defenses day by day, without even trying, just by being exactly who he was. "You know," she told him once, while they were picking apples together in her grandmother's old orchard, "sometimes I think maybe it's for the best that you don't remember your old life." "Why's that?" he asked, surprised. "Because maybe there was something in it that made you unhappy. And here, starting from scratch, you seem at peace. Really at peace." He froze then, apple still in hand, studying her face in the autumn sunlight. And for the first time in a long while, he thought, maybe she's right. Maybe there's no need to go digging for answers in a past that might not have been nearly as happy as he sometimes pictured it in his dreams. He had no idea then how wrong that thought would turn out to be. It happened on a winter evening, almost a year after he'd been discharged from the hospital. Molly was already fast asleep. Snow was falling quietly outside the window, and the fire crackled softly in the stove. Sarah was making tea. He sat at the table watching her, and suddenly realized he couldn't stay quiet any longer about what he was feeling. "Sarah," he said softly, once she'd sat down across from him, "there's something I want to tell you." She looked up at him, and in that look was so much anticipation, so much quiet hope, that it caught in his throat. "I don't know who I used to be," he went on, "but I know exactly who I've become here, next to you. And He reached for her hand, leaning closer, feeling his heart pound. At that exact moment, as their faces came within inches of each other, as their lips nearly touched, a flash exploded inside his head, bright deafening, tearing through the darkness where his past had been hiding. He saw a wedding, a spacious hall, white flowers, a woman in a wedding dress reciting her vows. He saw a ring on his own hand. He saw a boardroom, a long table, dozens of faces turned toward him, waiting for a decision. He saw a logo on a screen, the same 3 interlocking lines that had haunted his dreams in the hospital, and suddenly understood it wasn't some random image from a dream, but the logo of his own company. He saw crumpled metal, a car flipping over, pain, darkness. "Adam?" Sarah called out, frightened, watching him suddenly recoil, grabbing his head. He sat there, eyes squeezed shut, letting the avalanche of images wash over him. A year of absolute emptiness breaking open all at once. When it finally settled, he opened his eyes and looked at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, not because he'd forgotten her, but because he was looking at her now as an entirely different man. "I remember," he whispered. "I'm married. I have a company. I had a whole life." Sarah slowly pulled back, and something passed over her face. Not hurt, exactly, but something more complicated. The realization that a man she'd let herself grow attached to, with her whole heart, had, it turned out, never fully belonged to her at all. "I'm happy for you," she said quietly, and there was no falseness in her voice, only an honest, heavy sadness. "Really, you'll finally get to know who you are." "Sarah, I don't know what happens now." "You need to go," she cut in, gently but firmly. "You have a wife. You have a whole life you need to go find and make sense of. You can't just stay here knowing all this." He wanted to argue, wanted to say he wasn't ready to leave, that he didn't want to lose what he'd found here in this little house. But something inside him, some deep-rooted sense of duty and decency, told him Sarah was right. He owed it to himself to go back, sort things out, understand what had happened to his life before he tried to build anything new. She didn't make a scene. She didn't cry in front of him, though. As he'd learned later, she cried alone in the kitchen the whole night while he packed his few belongings. In the morning, she packed him food for the road, gave him every bit of savings she had, just to tide you over till you sort things out, and walked him to the bus station. "You'll write, won't you?" Molly asked, hugging him tight goodbye, tears standing in her young eyes. "I promise," he said, fighting the lump in his throat. The bus pulled out, carrying him away from the one place he'd truly been happy in the past year. Sarah stood at the stop, watching until the bus disappeared around the bend, then slowly walked home, to the place where, just yesterday, it had felt like life was finally starting to fall into place. Neither of them knew then that, right up to the end of this story, she'd have no idea she hadn't just seen off some lonely man without papers, but one of the wealthiest men in the country. The trip home took nearly a full day. First a bus to the county center, then a train, then another bus into Seattle. The whole time, his memory kept surging back in pieces, like a dam finally giving way. He remembered his full name, remembered his home address, remembered the company's phone line, remembered his mother's face, long since gone. Remembered the early years of the studio. Remembered Christine, her laugh, her perfume, the way she used to tilt her head listening to him. He got to Seattle late in the evening and went straight to the address he remembered as home. But a family he didn't know answered the door. A young couple with a small child, staring in alarm at the disheveled man, insisting this was his house. "We bought this place a year and a half ago," the husband explained, confused. "From the previous owner, a woman. All the paperwork checked out. You can look it up at the county recorder's office." Adam stood on the porch, feeling the ground fall away beneath him. He drove to the company's office, the same building where the scene with the security guard, described at the very beginning of this story, took place. The scene that finally made it clear to him. While he lay in a hospital bed with no memory, someone had methodically, piece by piece, dismantled his entire former life. He tried to get into the bank where he'd once held his personal accounts, but he was politely informed the accounts had been closed for inactivity more than a year ago, and any information about the transactions would require official identification, which, of course, he didn't have. He tried tracking down old friends, people he'd known since before the company took off, back to his college years. One of them, seeing him standing on the doorstep, slammed the door in a panic, muttering something about not wanting trouble. Another, meeting him at a coffee shop, kept glancing around nervously, as if afraid of being seen with him, and soon left in a hurry, claiming urgent business. Adam couldn't make sense of the fear until a former co-worker run into on the street told him, after a lot of hesitation before she even dared speak to him, that Derek Collins, now CEO, was known for coming down hard on anyone who so much as questioned the official story. 2 employees who'd publicly voiced doubts about Adam's sudden disappearance were let go under terms that made it nearly impossible for them to find work anywhere else in the industry. After that, nobody was willing to take the risk. The hardest part was running into Christine. He spotted her by chance outside a high-end restaurant in an elegant coat on Derek's arm. She was just as beautiful, just as put together, as she'd been the last time he saw her 2 years earlier. Adam froze, not believing his own eyes, then stepped toward her. "Christine!" he called out. She raised her eyes to his, and for a split second, he thought he caught something like recognition in them, something like fear. But an instant later, her face settled into an expression of polite, mildly disgusted confusion, the kind reserved for an intrusive stranger. "I'm sorry, you have me confused with someone else," she said, in an even voice, gripping Derek's arm tighter, and the two of them walked past without looking back. Adam stood there on the sidewalk, feeling something inside him finally give way. Not his business, not his money, but something more fundamental. The belief that anyone in this city still cared whether he existed. He was completely alone. No papers, no money, no roof over his head, not a single person willing to vouch for who he was. For the first week in the city, he slept at the Greyhound station, among other nameless, cast-off people the police periodically ran off, demanding to see ID. He didn't even have the temporary ID the hospital had issued him. It had been lost somewhere along the way, along with everything else. He picked up whatever work he could find that didn't ask for papers. Unloading trucks at a produce warehouse for cash, washing dishes at a cheap diner where the owner, asking no questions, paid him under market rate, knowing a man with no documents had nowhere to complain. He saved every cent, setting it aside for the one thing he needed most, getting his identity back. The process of proving who he was turned out to be far harder than he could have imagined. Officially, Adam Walker wasn't dead, but he'd been declared legally missing by court order, and once the deadline passed, every document bearing his name had simply been voided. To prove he was alive, to get his name back, he'd have to go through courts, expert testimony, endless bureaucratic offices, and all of it cost money he didn't have. He turned to a free legal aid clinic for low-income clients. A young attorney named Ryan Clark, working there pro bono, listened to his story with obvious skepticism. It sounded too far-fetched, too much like the plot of a cheap crime show. But something about the way this disheveled, clearly educated, and articulate man spoke made Ryan dig deeper. "All right," he said finally. "Let's start with the simplest thing. DNA testing can confirm your identity if we can find something to compare it against. Biological samples from your parents, if they ever had testing done, or, if we're lucky, your own old medical records with samples on file. It's a long road, but not an impossible one. What followed was a long, grueling fight, tracking down archived medical records, filing request after request with various agencies, trying to find any physical trace of his old identity. Every step was a struggle. Every small win, an old medical chart turned up, a fingerprint found in a county police archive, was immediately followed by a new obstacle. An office that had lost the paperwork, a newly required form nobody had mentioned before, delays dragging on for months in the bureaucratic grind. Once, when Ryan finally managed to get an official test scheduled, the clinic they'd contacted suddenly sent back a denial, no explanation given. It later came out, though there was no way to prove it, that someone, learning of Adam's efforts to reclaim his identity, had pressured the clinic through well-connected contacts. "They know I'm alive," Adam told Ryan then, with a bitter laugh. "And they're doing everything they can to make sure I can't prove it." "Then we need to be smarter about this," the young attorney answered, a real fire for justice having lit up in him over the months they'd worked together. "Going at them head-on is useless if they've got that kind of pull. We need to find another way in." In the darkest moments of that fight, every time another door closed in his face, every time a fresh hope turned into a fresh disappointment, the one thing that kept him going was his phone calls to Mapleton. He called Sarah from a cheap flip phone bought with his first earnings, every evening he could manage. She never asked when he'd be coming back, never pushed, never demanded explanations about the past he was now, slowly, piece by piece, revealing to her, still keeping quiet about the scale of who he'd once been. He told her he'd owned a small company, but he was tied up in a complicated legal battle with his ex-wife over paperwork. And that was true, just not the whole truth. "You holding up?" she'd usually ask first. And there was so much genuine care packed into that simple question that it caught his breath every single time. "Trying to," he'd answer. "Rough day today." "Tell me," she'd say. And he would. Not because she could fix his problems, but simply because pain spoken out loud always felt a little lighter. Sarah never offered more money than she had to give, never complained about her own hardships, though she certainly had plenty. Her mother, slowly recovering from the stroke, needing constant care, her mill paycheck barely stretching to cover the bills, Molly growing, expenses growing right along with her. But every time he called, there was never exhaustion in her voice, only warmth. "You know what Molly told me today?" she said once. "Asked when Uncle Adam's coming back to fix the swing. I told her I didn't know, and she said, 'That's okay, I'll wait. He promised he'd write, and he doesn't lie.'" Hey everyone, quick pause here. If this story's made you stop and think, or brought back a memory of your own, leave a like. That little sign means a lot. It's how I know these stories are really reaching people. And tell me, what city or country are you listening from? I love seeing people from all over the world gather around one story like this. Thanks for sticking with me. Let's keep going. He was quiet on the phone for a long while after that, feeling the lump rise in his throat. "I'm going to come back," he said finally. "As soon as I get all this sorted out, I promise." Sarah never asked exactly what he meant by all this, sensing, without needing to be told, that there was more to his story than what showed on the surface, but respecting his right to tell the truth when he was ready. Those calls, that quiet support that asked for nothing in return, became his anchor through the darkest stretches of the fight. The days when another court date got pushed back, when another witness refused to talk out of fear of powerful opponents, when it seemed like the system, built on Derek and Christine's money and connections, simply wasn't going to leave a man with no paperwork any chance at all of proving the obvious: that he existed, and that he was exactly who he claimed to be. The investigation Ryan was running, together with a private investigator hired on credit against a future payout if they won, eventually turned up a lead on the accident itself. Footage from a security camera at a roadside diner near the crash site, miraculously still sitting in an archive after a long search, had caught the truck involved in the collision. The truck was registered to Neil Graham. The first time Adam heard that name and saw the grainy archive photo, a wave of fury rose up in him unlike anything he'd felt in the entire nightmare of the past year. There he was, the man who'd flipped his car, who'd crippled his life, cost him his memory, his family, his future. "Find him," he told Ryan and the investigator, with a hardness that wasn't like him at all. "I want to look him in the eye." Finding Neil wasn't easy. The trucker had switched employers a few times over the past 2 years, moved to a different county, almost as if he were trying to outrun his own past. When the investigator finally tracked down his current address and Adam showed up unannounced, the door was opened by a frightened woman, Neil's wife. "He's not home," she said quickly, clearly on edge. "And he won't be." "Tell him I know about the accident," Adam said quietly, "and that sooner or later, he's going to have to answer for it." The woman went pale and shut the door. For weeks, Neil avoided any contact. Once, Adam spotted him from a distance at a gas station. The trucker noticed him, hurried into his cab, and drove off without even finishing filling his tank. Another time, when Adam nearly caught up with him at the freight depot where Neil worked, the man slipped out through an employee exit, and security wouldn't let Adam onto the property. "He's clearly afraid of something," Ryan observed, thinking through the pattern. An ordinary criminal hired for a one-off job would just deny everything to your face or lawyer up. He's acting like a man cornered by something a lot bigger than just not wanting to answer for what he did. That observation stuck with Adam, even as his fury kept clouding his judgment. He was convinced. Graham was one of the main culprits, a hired thug, however unsuccessful, willing to do anything for money. He had no idea yet how incomplete that picture really was. Late one evening, as Adam was about to give up on another failed stakeout outside the depot, the same woman, Neil's wife, approached him. "My name's Vanessa," she said quietly, glancing around nervously. "Please, leave my husband alone, at least for now. He's already—" She hesitated. "He's already living with this every single day. He hasn't slept right in 2 years. If you knew what really happened out there, you might not judge him so harshly." "Then let him tell me the truth," Adam answered firmly. "I'm ready to listen." "He's scared," Vanessa whispered. "Not of you, of the people behind all this. If he talks, he's not just putting himself in danger. Our daughter, too." She turned and hurried off, leaving Adam standing in the dark with a growing, uneasy suspicion that there was something far more complicated behind this story than simple greed from one hired driver. While Adam kept pulling on the threads leading toward the truth about the accident, Derek and Christine, learning through their own sources about his relentless efforts to reclaim his identity and about the young attorney he'd found, decided to strike first. Derek, using old connections in law enforcement, launched an investigation into Ryan, supposedly over a complaint from a disgruntled client accusing the young attorney of fraud. The accusation was entirely fabricated, but the mere fact that an inquiry had been opened meant Ryan's ability to practice law was suspended for the duration of the review, at least on paper. It was a calculated blow, meant to strip Adam of his one real professional ally. "I'm so sorry," Ryan said, breaking the news, clearly shaken. "I can't officially handle your case until this review clears, and that could take months." Adam felt the ground give way beneath him again. Just as hope had started to flicker, a scheduled test, a few documented leads, he'd hit a dead end all over again. The same week brought another piece of bad news. The private investigator helping with the case suddenly backed out, citing vague, personal circumstances. Adam would later learn the investigator had been strongly encouraged not to get involved in this case, an encouragement backed by a sum well beyond his usual fee, and an equally clear hint about what might happen to his license if he refused. Adam found himself essentially alone against a system built by years of money and connections. In despair, he called Sarah that night, not to ask for help she had no way of giving, but simply because there was no one else left to talk to. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, for the first time in all their calls, and there was a real, unguarded exhaustion in his voice, the exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting alone for far too long. "Maybe I should just let it go, start over, come out there, find work in the county, forget all of this." A long pause hung on the other end of the line. "I'd love it if you came back," Sarah said finally, quiet but firm. "I really would. But I know you, even if it hasn't been that long. You're not a man who gives up and lives with something unresolved eating at him. If you walk away now, this injustice is going to gnaw at you for the rest of your life, and sooner or later, it'll poison the very thing we might be able to build together. Don't give up for the company. Don't give up for the money. Give up for yourself, so that one day, looking in the mirror, you see a man who fought for the truth, not one who ran from it." Her words, simple and honest, gave him exactly the push he needed. He didn't have the right to give up, not because ambition demanded it, but because the truth, however bitter, deserved to see the light. He thanked her and hung up with a new, if fragile, resolve. It was right at this moment of near total hopelessness, just as Adam was on the verge of accepting defeat, that something happened that seemed, at last, to offer real hope. A former board member, a man named Victor Hayes, who had retired long before any of this happened, but still held formal voting rights as a minority shareholder, reached out to him unexpectedly through a mutual acquaintance. Victor Hayes had known Adam since the company's very first years, remembered him as he truly was, remembered every detail of his handwriting, his way of running a negotiation. "I heard about what you've been trying to do," the older man said at a quiet meeting in an out-of-the-way coffee shop. "And I'm prepared to swear under oath that the man in front of me is genuinely Adam Walker. What's more, I still have a set of old meeting minutes with your signature on them, which could be used for a handwriting comparison." For the first time in months, Adam had an ally with real weight in the business world. Not a struggling public interest attorney, not a retired bookkeeper, but a man whose name meant something in court and in the press. Victor Hayes promised to arrange a meeting with several other old shareholders willing to support reopening the case. For the first time in a long while, Adam let himself believe victory was within reach. He called Sarah that evening with an unfamiliar, almost forgotten lightness in his voice. "I think the ice is finally breaking," he said. "Maybe this ends sooner than I thought." But a week later, arriving at the agreed meeting with Victor Hayes and the promised shareholders, he found only one person waiting at the cafe, Victor Hayes himself, pale, avoiding his eyes. "I'm so sorry," the old man said quietly. "I got a call. A reminder about an old debt my son took on, a big loan he personally guaranteed a few years back, from an outfit that turns out to be connected to Collins's people. They made it very clear, Either I forget about your case, or the loan gets called immediately, and my son loses his house, maybe his freedom too, over the default." "I understand," Adam managed, feeling the hope that had only just begun to spread its wings crumble to dust. "The only thing I can still do," Victor Hayes said, pulling a thin folder from his briefcase, "is leave you these documents, anonymously. From here, you're on your own. I'm sorry." He left, leaving the folder on the table. Inside were, in fact, a few valuable documents, but the promised public backing of powerful shareholders was never going to happen. One more door, only just cracked open, had slammed shut in his face again. Adam sat alone in the emptied-out cafe, staring at the thin folder, a tiny, fragile trophy bought at the price of someone else's fear. He understood. The people on the other side weren't playing by any rules of decency. They were playing to hold on to power at any cost, willing to lean on the most painful pressure point of anyone who dared to stand with him. That evening, for the first time in a long while, he didn't call Sarah. Not because he didn't want to hear her voice, but because he couldn't find the strength to say another defeat out loud. He just sat in the dark of his rented room, staring at the ceiling, feeling his strength slowly drain out of him. The phone rang on its own. It was Sarah, worried by his silence. "What happened?" she asked immediately, no preamble, catching something wrong even in his polite, "Hey," without missing a beat. He told her everything. About Victor Hayes, about the threats, about hope collapsing yet again. Sarah listened in silence, and then said something he'd remember for the rest of his life. "You know what separates the person who finally wins from the one who gives up? It's not how many times they get knocked down. Everybody gets knocked down about the same number of times. The only difference is whether they get back up after the last one." Those words, simple and free of any grand speeches, gave him just enough strength to pick the folder back up in the morning and keep searching, this time even more carefully, even smarter, understanding now that his opponents were willing to press on the weak point of anyone who stood in his corner. With no lawyer and no investigator left, Adam started working the case himself, methodically, with the same persistence he'd once used to build a company from nothing. He remembered that among his former employees were people who'd been loyal to him personally, not to a title. But finding them, with no access to his old contacts, proved to be no easy task. Help came from a direction he never expected. A former employee, Joan Miller, an older woman who had worked as a bookkeeper back when the company was first getting off the ground, recognized him by chance at the market where he'd been unloading crates for cash. She studied his face for a long moment, then gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Adam? My God, is that really you? We all thought." She told him something he hadn't known, that many of the old employees who'd known him personally had never bought the official story of his disappearance, but were too afraid to say so out loud after the very public firings of the few who dared to question it. Joan, retired 2 years now and no longer dependent on the company, was ready to help. "I've still got old accounting archives on an external drive," she said. "From back when I worked there. There might be something useful in it. Signatures, documents in your original handwriting, even old photos from company parties where your face is clearly visible." That turned out to be the first real breakthrough. With those archives and a new attorney, young but ambitious, recommended by Joan herself, who knew him as an honest and principled lawyer, Adam began building his case again, this time more carefully, trying not to draw the other side's attention too soon. At the same time, he kept an eye on Neil Graham, trying to understand the nature of his fear. Through Joan, who knew a lot of people in the industry, he learned an indirect but important detail. About a month before the accident, Derek Collins had personally met with a man named Frank, someone with no fixed occupation, said to specialize in handling delicate matters for wealthy clients. There was no direct proof linking this go-between to the accident, but the chain of circumstantial coincidences kept growing more distinct. "If your read on this is right," the new attorney said, studying the collected evidence, "then Graham isn't the mastermind. He's the one who carried it out, and maybe didn't even fully understand what he was getting into. That changes the whole picture. If we can get him to testify against the real people behind this, it becomes decisive proof, not just of your identity, but of the entire scheme to seize the company." Adam realized what he needed wasn't revenge against Neil, but a way to get him to talk. He remembered what Vanessa had said, that her husband had something to lose, not just himself, but his family. And he decided to change his approach. Instead of threats and pursuit, an offer of protection and understanding. Adam wrote Neil a letter, not through intermediaries, not through threats, just a simple, handwritten letter which he gave to Vanessa personally to pass along. "Neil," he wrote, "for a long time I hated you for what happened to me. But I've come to understand you're probably just as much a victim of this whole thing as I am, only from the other side. I don't want your blood. I want the truth. If you're afraid for your family, I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to protect you and Paige, if you decide to tell me what really happened. It's your call. But understand this, as long as the truth stays buried, innocent people keep paying for it. You, me, and maybe someone else we don't even know about yet." Nearly 2 weeks passed without an answer. Adam had started to think the letter hadn't worked, when late one evening, there was a knock at the door of the rented room he now stayed in, paid for with his own modest earnings. Neil Graham stood on the doorstep, gaunt, looking far older than his years, with the eyes of a man carrying a weight he couldn't bear anymore. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. "I need to tell you everything. I can't live with this anymore." They talked almost the entire night. Neil told him everything, from the beginning, about his sick daughter, about the desperate need for money, about a man named Frank who'd offered him a simple job: stage a harmless, controlled accident, after which a wealthy businessman would just drop out of his active life for a few months. "They swore to me nobody would get seriously hurt," Neil said, fighting back tears. "I didn't want to hurt anybody. I just wanted to save my daughter. But it all went wrong. The road was wet. The car caught the edge of the shoulder. I stood there and watched you, bleeding in that flipped-over car, and I wanted to call an ambulance myself right then. But Frank's people showed up. They took your wallet, your phone, everything. Said they'd take care of it, that this was the plan all along, so nobody could identify you fast. I wanted to scream, to stop them, but I was so scared." "And after?" Adam asked, feeling his fury slowly give way to something more complicated: understanding. "The blackmail started later," Neil went on. "A month, maybe a month and a half after. Paige had already had her surgery. She was recovering. I thought the worst was behind me. Then Frank called again. Turns out he'd recorded everything on video. Me handing over your things, me agreeing to keep quiet. He said if I ever said a word to anyone, that video would end up with the police, and I'd go down as the main perpetrator, not just someone involved in an accident, but an accomplice to a crime with aggravating circumstances, since the victim's documents had been stolen. And he wanted money. Not once, over and over, again and again. Paige's surgery was already paid for. My daughter was saved. But that money stopped feeling like mine. I went into new debt just to keep paying him for 2 years straight. I lived in constant fear that you'd find me, and at the same time, fear the police would find me if I ever tried to tell the truth. Adam listened to this confession, feeling his own pain, built up over 2 years, tangled together with the pain of this exhausted, cornered man. Neil wasn't a monster. He was a father, pushed into an impossible choice, and then ruthlessly used by people who'd been planning something far worse from the very beginning. "Who ordered the accident?" Adam asked directly. "Do you know who was behind Frank?" "I don't know any names directly," Neil said, shaking his head. "But once, by chance, I saw Frank meeting with a man in an expensive suit outside a business center. I took a photo on my phone just in case, some instinct telling me it might come in handy someday, for my own protection. I still have it." He pulled out an old phone, scrolled through the gallery, and showed Adam a photograph. The photo, blurry, taken from a distance but plainly recognizable, showed Derek Collins. Adam stared at the photo for a long time, feeling the last of his doubts crumble away. This was the final, decisive link in the chain of evidence. Direct proof connecting the man behind the accident to the man now sitting as CEO of his company. "Will you give an official statement?" he asked quietly. "Against Frank? Against Derek? I promise you protection, the best attorneys, whatever it takes, to keep you and your family safe from any fallout from the blackmail." Neil was quiet for a long time, staring at the floor. "Yes," he said finally, lifting his eyes, full of tears of relief. "Yes. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of my daughter growing up next to a father who wakes up in a cold sweat every single night. I want this to be over, whatever it costs me." That confession became the emotional turning point of Adam's entire story, the moment when two men, both victims of the same cold calculation, finally joined forces against the people truly responsible. With Neil's testimony, the photograph, Jones' old archives, and the persistent work of the new attorney, the case took on an entirely different scale. This was no longer just an effort to recover lost paperwork. It had become a criminal investigation into fraud, forged powers of attorney, staged vehicular assault, and grand-scale theft of property. The police, finally holding real evidence instead of just the claims of an undocumented man, had no choice but to open a formal case. Frank, the go-between, was located and taken into custody within a week. Facing a real prospect of a long sentence, he began cooperating with investigators almost immediately, confirming Neil's account and naming the people who'd hired him: Derek Collins and Christine. DNA testing, ordered now through an official court process, rather than a clinic that had caved to pressure, confirmed without question. The man once logged in hospital records as unidentified individual known as Adam was in fact Adam Walker, the legal founder and owner of Nexora Games. News of this broke like a bomb across business and media circles alike. Journalists who'd once shrugged off the story of a homeless man with an unbelievable tale were now lining up for exclusive interviews. Adam turned down every single one. He wasn't after media attention. All he wanted was justice, done properly, through the law. The trial ran for several months. Derek Collins, who initially tried to deny everything and hired the best defense attorneys money could buy, found himself facing an overwhelming body of evidence. Testimony from Frank and Neil, the photograph from their meeting, financial records showing company funds funneled into shell accounts tied directly to him and to Christine. Christine held out longer, with the same cold composure that had helped her build the whole scheme in the first place. The turning point came when investigators were authorized to seize Frank's personal records. It turned out the careful go-between, in the habit of covering himself in case of trouble with clients, the same way he'd kept Neil on a leash for years, had secretly recorded his own conversations with Derek, keeping them, just in case, in the event he ever needed leverage. Among those recordings, investigators found a conversation in which Derek and Frank openly discussed the details of the controlled accident. When that recording was played in the courtroom, Christine's defense began to fall apart. On the last day of the trial, as the judge read through the case findings, Adam sat in the courtroom, looking at the woman he'd once loved more than his own life, trusted completely, planned to grow old with. She didn't look at him, sat with her head down, for the first time in a long while, stripped of her flawless mask. During a recess, when the escort brought her out into the hallway for a few minutes, Adam asked for permission to approach, just to talk, no lawyers, off the record. Christine raised her eyes to his, and for the first time in 2 years, there was no coldness in them, no performance, only exhaustion. "Why?" he asked quietly. Just that one word. He wasn't looking to accuse her or lay blame. He genuinely wanted to understand. She was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing whether it was worth answering honestly. "I don't know exactly when it started," she said finally. "I probably stopped loving you long before I ever admitted it to myself. And after that, it was easier to just drift along than to change anything. Getting a real divorce would have meant losing half the life I'd gotten used to. And you were so calm, so trusting, that I stopped seeing you as a person. You just became an obstacle between me and what I wanted. There's no excuse for it. I just want you to know, this was never about hating you. It was about me, about who I let myself become." Adam listened, feeling something inside him finally close. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something close to release. "I wish you'd found the courage to just leave," he said. "A divorce wouldn't have destroyed me. This nearly did." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and went back into the courtroom, leaving behind not anger, but a quiet, final goodbye to a woman he now understood he might never have truly known at all. The court found Derek Collins and Christine Walker guilty of conspiracy to unlawfully seize property, forgery, and a string of related charges. Both received actual prison sentences. Every fraudulent document, the powers of attorney, the ruling declaring him legally missing, the divorce decree built on that ruling, the sale of the property, was voided by the court. Nexora Games was legally restored to its rightful founder. But when Adam walked out of the courthouse that day, he didn't feel the triumph he might have expected. What he felt was exhaustion. A deep, hard-won exhaustion. The kind that comes after walking through hell and finally seeing justice done. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet, growing ache for a little house in Mapleton, for the crackle of firewood in a stove, for a child's laughter, and for a woman who had never asked for anything in return for her kindness. With control of the company back in his hands, Adam's first move wasn't a press statement or a victory celebration. It was something he considered far more important. He personally appeared at Neil Graham's sentencing hearing, not as a victim demanding the harshest possible punishment, but as a man asking for leniency. He explained that Neil had been forced into the crime to save his daughter's life, that he'd been a victim of blackmail and manipulation by the real masterminds, that for 2 years he'd lived in constant guilt, and that, ultimately, of his own free will, he'd helped expose a far more serious crime. "I'm not defending what he did," Adam told the court. But I see a difference between a man who made a terrible mistake out of desperation and people who coldly planned the destruction of someone else's life for money. The first man deserves a second chance. The second two have already gotten the punishment they earned. The court took his petition into account, along with Neil's active cooperation with investigators, and handed down a far lighter sentence than the charge would normally carry, citing the mitigating circumstances. More than that, Adam quietly, through people he trusted, helped the Graham family, paying off the remaining debt built up over years of blackmail, covering ongoing medical care for Paige, and, after Neil's release, helping him find honest work, not at his own company, to avoid any gossip, but through a recommendation to someone he trusted. "Why are you doing this?" Joan asked him once, not quite believing the mercy she was witnessing. "After everything he did to you?" "Because he was a victim too," Adam answered simply. "And I know all too well what it feels like to be a victim of somebody else's cruelty. I don't want his family to suffer any more than they already have because of what he did." Changes were happening inside the company too. Not revolutionary ones, but thoughtful ones. Adam reinstated employees who'd been unfairly fired for voicing doubts about the official story of his disappearance. He personally thanked Joan Miller, setting her up with a generous lifetime pension on top of her state benefits. He held a company-wide meeting, not a grand, staged affair, but a warm, human one, where he shared part of his story and thanked everyone who'd helped him in any way, even just with a kind word during the darkest days. The press called his return the business story of the decade. Investors lined up, offering expansion deals, partnerships, mergers. He was offered book deals about what he'd been through, offers to appear in documentaries, invitations to speak on resilience. He turned it all down. He knew the real value he'd gained over those 2 brutal years had nothing to do with revenue or contract terms. It was measured in something else entirely. A simple house with a leaning fence, the crackle of firewood in a stove, a child's voice asking when he'd come back to fix the swing, and the quiet, unasking warmth of a woman who had fallen for him not as a millionaire, but simply as a man. He knew he was ready to go home, to his real home. He didn't throw a celebration for getting the company back. He didn't give a single interview, despite dozens of persistent requests. He simply got in his car one morning, an ordinary, unremarkable car, nothing to suggest his new-old status, and stopped at a roadside stand to buy some flowers. Not roses from an upscale florist, not orchids flown in on a special order, just a simple bouquet of wildflowers, daisies and cornflowers, tied together with string, the kind sold by an older woman on the roadside, laid out on an old plastic-covered table. The drive to Mapleton took 7 hours. Outside the window, familiar fields rolled by. The same woods where he used to help Molly hunt for mushrooms. The same bend in the road that opened up onto the little town with its leaning fences and chimney smoke over the rooftops. He pulled up outside the familiar house and stepped out, feeling his heart pound harder than it ever had in any business negotiation in his entire life. Molly, playing in the yard with the neighbor's dog, spotted him first. She froze for a second, staring, and then took off toward the house with an ecstatic shriek. "Mom! Mom! Uncle Adam's here! He came back!" The door swung open, and Sarah stepped out onto the porch, in a simple house dress, a dish towel clutched to her chest without thinking, the moment she saw him. For several long seconds, the two of them just stood there across the small yard, looking at each other, unable to speak. "You came back," she finally whispered, and her voice carried everything at once. Disbelief, hope, the fear of being left again, and, somewhere deep beneath it all, that same warmth he'd carried with him through every month of their separation. I promised, he said, walking closer, holding out the simple bouquet of wildflowers. I'm sorry it took so long. She took the flowers with trembling hands, breathing in their plain, faintly dusty scent of a summer valley. There's something important I need to tell you, he said quietly. I should have told you back then, but I didn't want it to change anything between us before it was time. Sarah, I didn't just own a small company. I founded one of the biggest studios in the country. I had money, status, everything people call success. And I lost all of it overnight. Not because I was a bad person, but because the people I trusted most betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. Sarah listened in silence, eyes wide, clutching the bouquet tighter and tighter. But you know what I've realized over these 2 years? He went on, taking her free hand in both of his. That back when I had nothing, no name, no memory, not a single dollar, you didn't see a future payoff in me, some potential investor. You just saw a man. You fed me when I had no way to pay you back a dime. You took me in, asking for nothing in return. You let me go, even though you clearly didn't want to, because you thought it was right for me. You never once asked who I used to be or what I used to have. None of that mattered to you. You just waited for me, exactly as I was. His voice broke. You didn't just save a stranger with no memory, Sarah. You saved my entire life. You showed me what it's actually supposed to look like, not about money, not about status, but about the people who stay by your side when you have nothing left to give them. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, still holding the bouquet close, and then slowly shook her head, not in refusal, but in a kind of quiet astonishment. I need a little time for this to sink in, she admitted. You're the same man who fixed my fence and couldn't remember a single fairy tale. And at the same time, a completely different one. Give me a day. Just be here today, like before. He stayed. The whole day passed almost the way hundreds of days before it had. He split firewood, even though there was no real need for it anymore, just the desire to feel at home again. Molly, glued to his side the entire time, chattered on breathlessly about everything that had happened while he was gone. A new teacher, the puppy they'd finally been allowed to get, how the swing really needed fixing again. Sarah made dinner, glancing at him now and then through the open kitchen window, as if she still couldn't quite believe he was really there. Over dinner, they barely talked about his past at all, just laughed, remembering small things. The first time he'd ever tried to milk a goat, the time he mixed up nettles for sorrel. By evening, once Molly, worn out from a whole day of excitement, had finally fallen asleep, Sarah carried out onto the porch the same old quilt they used to wrap themselves in on fall evenings, and sat down beside him under a sky that had gone dark, scattered with the first stars. It even smells the same tonight as it did back then, she said quietly. Except back then, I was scared you'd leave. Tonight, I'm scared I'm dreaming all of this. You're not dreaming, he answered, taking her hand. He stood, still holding her hand in his, and lowered himself quietly onto one knee, right there on the wooden porch, in the same spot where they'd sat together so many times before, asking nothing of each other at all. Sarah, I know I'm asking for a lot, to let into your life not just the man you took in, but a whole new reality with all its complications. But I promise you, next to you, I want to keep being exactly the man I became here in this house. Honest, hardworking, and loving you and Molly more than anything else in the world. Marry me. Sarah sat there, clutching the slightly wilted bouquet of wildflowers to her chest, tears running down her cheeks. Not bitter tears, but the kind that come with the realest, hardest won kind of happiness. Yes, she whispered finally, and then louder, through laughter and tears at once. Yes, of course, yes. For a second, a sleepy Molly appeared in the window, woken by the shouting, and, realizing what was happening, burst out onto the porch with a delighted shriek, throwing her arms around both of them, while somewhere in the neighboring yard, a dog started barking, as if it, too, were celebrating. Standing in the middle of a small yard in Mapleton, under a clear summer sky, Adam Walker, a man who'd lost everything and found something far more valuable, finally felt like he was home. Not in a mansion, not in the office of the country's largest game studio, but right here, in the arms of a woman who'd fallen for him when he was nobody, and who, now knowing the whole truth, kept loving him just as honestly as ever. Real love, it turned out, isn't measured in bank balances. It's measured in the willingness to stay when the rest of the world turns away. The willingness to share your last piece of bread without asking what it'll cost you. The willingness to wait, expecting nothing in return. And as this story shows, that kind of love, in the end, always turns out to be stronger than any amount of money, any amount of power, any betrayal. They kept the wedding small, held right in the yard of that same house in Mapleton, surrounded by neighbors, with Joan Miller in attendance, Ryan, who by then had become the company's permanent counsel, and even, to the surprise of many, the Graham family, whom Adam personally invited, finally closing that painful chapter with forgiveness instead of revenge. Neil, having served his sentence with all the mitigating factors taken into account, now worked as a driver for a small logistics company, honest, no longer looking over his shoulder. Paige, a healthy, boisterous 10-year-old now, had become such close friends with Molly that the two girls spent more of their summer at each other's houses than at their own. Adam didn't move Sarah and Molly to the city. Instead, he opened a small branch office of the company in the valley near Mapleton, focused on developing educational games for kids and, unlike in his old life, worked more often from home, behind that once leaning, now carefully repaired fence, than from any office in downtown Seattle. He explained it simply. I built this company once by spending every free minute of my life to earn it. Now I want to build it without losing the one thing that actually matters. In the evenings, once Molly and later Jake, the son he and Sarah welcomed a year on, had fallen asleep, he'd still go out with his wife to that same porch, wrap himself in that same quilt that always smelled like the old farmhouse, and sit listening to the quiet, broken only now and then by the chirp of crickets. No regrets? Sarah asked him once, thinking back to that night 2 years earlier when he'd first shown up on the hospital steps, a man with no name. You know, he answered, pulling her closer against his shoulder. If someone offered me the chance to turn back time and skip all that pain, on the condition that I'd never meet you, I'd say no, without a second's hesitation. Sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you turns out to be the door to the thing that matters most. Somewhere far away, in the glass office towers of Seattle, the Nexora Games sign still gleamed, a symbol of one man's persistence and talent rising up from nothing. But the real treasure he'd gained, at the cost of losing everything, wasn't that building at all. It was here, in the quiet yard of a small town, under a sky full of stars, in the arms of a woman who had loved him back when he had nothing to offer but a good heart and a stubborn belief that the truth wins out in the end. Well, friends, that brings us to the end of our story. Adam's story reminds us that money and possessions aren't the only things we stand to lose. Sometimes life takes something much bigger. your name, your memory, your trust in people, even the life you thought you knew. But it also shows us that no betrayal, no lie, and no one else's greed can permanently break a person who still holds on to honesty, strength of character, and the will to fight for the truth. When the people Adam trusted most turned their backs on him, he found, unexpectedly, people who helped him for no reason at all, except that they saw a human being in front of them. And maybe that kind of support turns out to be the most valuable thing there is. So here's my question for you today. What do you think is worse? Losing everything you own, or realizing one day that you've been betrayed by the people closest to you? And do you believe that the good a person puts out into the world always finds its way back to them eventually, even when it feels, at first, like there's no justice left in this world at all? Share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe your story, or your words, will be exactly what someone out there needs to hear right now. Someone going through a hard time. Someone who's almost given up on people. If this story touched you, show it some love with a like. And subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about betrayal, love, hope, justice, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Check out our other stories too. You'll find them right on your screen. This has been narrated by Michael. Take care of yourselves and the people you love. And never forget, a person's true worth doesn't show up when they have everything. It shows up when they find the strength to rise after losing what feels like absolutely everything.